So what are we going to do today? Haddon and I, my co-presenter, I'm going to introduce myself for those of you who haven't had a chance to meet me. My name is Kevin Jones, and I'm the managing partner at Odyssey Medical. I've been involved and interested in mass gathering for a long time. If I think about my history in events, I'm a board member currently with the Event Safety Alliance of Canada, and a board member of the World Athletics Endurance Sport Medicine Institute. I have nothing to declare at this moment other than my obvious declarations. And you'll note by my name, because my co-presenter has a lot of initials, I have none except for ABC 1, 2, 3. So I graduated kindergarten and I know my alphabet. Over to you, Haddon.
Hey guys, great to see you all. A lot of familiar faces, which is terrific. My name is Haddon. I'm a registered nurse based out of Vancouver. I work with the medical direction program at Odyssey, and I'm also part of the research team, the Mass Gathering Medicine interest group based at UBC. Like Kevin, I don't have any conflicts of interest to declare, but yeah, thank you guys so much for coming in today. Really excited to talk about this. We know that we're talking to a really dialed in group today, and you guys already have such an expansive amount of knowledge on this stuff. So what we're really trying to do today is sprinkle in some academic stuff, talk about some operational aspects, and kind of bring it together in about 30 odd minutes.
Which is ticking away. The presenters and Odyssey acknowledge the Indigenous and ancestral lands and territorial lands that we work, play, and live on, given the fact that we are coming to you across the country. If you've noticed in the chat, I think we've got as far east as Nova Scotia and probably far west as, I don't know, maybe Port Moody, maybe a little further. And we've got Elliott Lake is probably the furthest north that I've seen. For those of you who don't know where that is, look it up. It's where Jenna's from. But we couldn't acknowledge every land, but we acknowledge in principle that we're respectful of the privileges that we have to operate, work, play on the lands of the Indigenous people of Canada. Our outline, what do we hope? We're breaking this down into two. We're breaking this down into two parts. The takeaways for part one is really what is mass gathering. It's not a standardized field and understanding. It's a mix of a bunch of different fields. How are we losing and using comparative metrics, which the ones that we started looking at and saying, what are we using to measure mass gathering and the impact? And then what are the ones that are emerging? So we've lost a few and we've gained a few. And we acknowledge that there's very few regulations that govern the behavior and actions of mass gatherings, both spontaneous and pre-planned. Part two is we're just going to do Haddon and I are going to do a bit of a podcast Q&A. What interests you about MGM? What makes MGM challenging? And then what does the future hold for MGM? Please accept the term MGM as mass gathering medicine. It's a term that encompasses everything that we do with respect to the various levels of professions that work in our space. So I'm going to pass this over to Haddon real quick, and he's going to be, we're a good team. Hey, I'm an ops guy, and he's an academic with an ops underlay. So I'm going to give him all the technical definitions, and he'll stick to helping us define. Over to Haddon for a brief history of mass gathering.
Awesome. Yeah, thanks so much, Kevin. So really we're gonna keep this nice and quick. I think it's just helpful to kind of understand where mass gathering medicine has come from, and kind of get an idea as to where it's gonna go. So really, this isn't a new field, so to speak. The first paper on this actually came out in 1971. And then through the 80s and 90s, it really began to get investigated with some case studies. But again, it was very much a blip on the radar at that time. In the mid 2000s is when things really started to pick up. So really within the last kind of like 15, 20 years is when actual papers started to come out, and we started to develop some models and think a little bit more critically around like what mass gatherings are and how they actually impact our health system. And then in the early 2010s is when the World Health Organization, WHO, really began to focus in on some research and partner up with some different research groups in order to sort of accelerate this research and bring it to the forefront, which has been terrific. Since then, there have been 6 countries that have notably been publishing and really working towards some common goals in this field. And right now, mass gathering medicine sort of lives its home, or its domain is sort of under emergency medicine in some capacity. So we're still trying to figure out exactly where it is, since it is such an interdisciplinary and such a collaborative field. But that's a quick overview of the last kind of 40 years of this. So this is a field that is still pretty new. And so there's still things that are being defined. And like we mentioned earlier, there isn't as much standardization in here as we'd like. So we're going to define a few things first. Obviously, a lot of if not everyone on this call is super familiar with mass gatherings and event medicine as a whole. And so we thought it'd be helpful just to pull those definitions to make sure that we're all talking about the same thing. So this is the World Health Organization's definition of mass gatherings. And really the big thing here is that they emphasize that it can be planned or spontaneous. So I think for a lot of us here, we're most comfortable in the planned mass gathering situation where we have a long runway and we're really able to dedicate resources to the planning and the rollout of care at these sort of events. But this is also acknowledging that there are lots of spontaneous events that can happen without notice, without the proper resources, and that can lead to consequences that we don't want to happen. And mass gathering medicine, it still isn't fully defined, but we really like to think that this is a field that really kind of brings together emergency medicine, pre-hospital care, disaster medicine, preparedness, public health, and emergency management all under one umbrella. With this field as well as all throughout healthcare, it really requires the collaboration of every discipline in order to succeed and to work together for the common goal. Like a lot of other areas, this is really a team sport, and I think everyone who's been on events together can really feel that this isn't a singular discipline, this isn't a singular scope. This really takes everybody to reach the finish line. So when we're at events, there's usually a few different types of care that are being offered. The first is a first aid level of coverage. So we work in Canada up to the emergency medical responder scope for first aid, and this is usually done without symptom relief. So someone who, symptom relief where we aren't able to provide medications or interventions that could relieve somebody of a symptom that they're having while on an event. This isn't always true because medical directives and protocols can allow that thing to happen, those sort of things to happen, but also not every medical team has those. And so it's just important to recognize that when we're at events, there are different levels of care that can be provided. At a lot of our events, which we're so fortunate to have, we have higher level care or HLC teams on site. So these are teams that have a bevy of clinicians, usually with the ability to legally assess, treat, prescribe, and diagnose, which is really, really helpful. And so when we have these teams, we often have physicians, nurse practitioners, advanced care paramedics, primary care paramedics, registered nurses, licensed practical nurses. We have the whole team, which is terrific, and we're able to work within our scope to really mitigate the number of folks who are being transferred to the hospital and the impacts that these events can have on the local healthcare system. The last sort of care that we'll see at events is harm reduction focused, which in the last few years has really had a strong uptick, which is terrific. And so I'm sure everyone is quite familiar, but these services are really focused on mitigating outcomes associated with lifestyle choices at festivals. So the range of harm reduction varies quite significantly depending on where you are. Some festivals, for instance, have on-site drug testing where you can get a report as to what's contained in those substances that you may be using. Other festivals or other areas provide education, handouts, really going around to help educate and support. So there's a really nice spectrum. And the literature is starting to catch up to this and really emphasize and affirm that these services are needed at events, especially those that are art and music focused. And so hopefully we'll see more of this in the future. So one of the big things within the academic side of mass gathering medicine is really trying to figure out how do we compare events, because there hasn't been a lot of standardization. And because of that, it's really hard to know what the impact of these events actually have on local systems and what these events are actually seeing. So the goal of having these metrics and the goal of really focusing on standardization is so that if there's an event in Canada that has the exact same profile as an event in Australia, we can accurately compare the two and see what happened, see the outcomes, and really take that into account with our planning and our systems. So the first metric that we'll talk about is our PPR, our patient presentation rate. And this is done per 1,000 attendees. So this gives us a bit of a scale to understand when you have 1,000 attendees, how many of those folks actually required care. And I have an example in a few minutes as well. So we'll see how this sort of looks. The next common metric that we use is our PPST, our percentage of patients seen and transferred to the hospital. So these are, of all the patients that we had in our care, what percentage of those are being sent to the hospital? And this is being sent to the hospital by cab, by an ambulance, a friend, the person maybe drove themselves. So really any way that that individual got to the hospital is what we capture here. So how many people actually left their care? The next metric is our TTHR, our transfer to hospital rate per 1,000. And so what we're looking at here is really kind of flipping that PPST, that percentage, and understanding on a per 1,000 level, how many people at the festival actually needed to go to the hospital in some way, in some capacity. And the last one that we'll talk about is our ATR, our ambulance transport rate, or transfer rate. So how many patients do we send to the hospital via ambulance per 1,000? So again, this is really nice that we can kind of chop things up. It's easy to compare, and it allows us to compare events a little bit more accurately, because the small events, which we'll talk about a little bit, that have maybe 500 people can be compared in a similar way to those mega events that have 500,000 people or something there, or millions and millions of people. So it provides a bit more context and a bit more of a background for us to have those discussions. So I'm going to pull from a paper that we wrote, Dr. Amlan, Dr. Shilter, Dr. Brenneman, Chris Callahan, and I from 2018. In this paper, we looked at 4 festivals across Canada over 2 years, and these were some of the findings that we had from the metrics. So we had a little over 630,000 people estimated that attended these events, and of that number, we had 10,406 patient encounters. So 10,406 people came to seek care at these events throughout the duration. So knowing this, and knowing that our level of care was higher level care, HLC, so we had physicians, nurse practitioners, ACP, PCs, RNs, LPNs, everyone, first aiders on the team there. When it came out to get these metrics, so we can compare events and compare how this looks across the spectrum, these were some of the findings that came out. So our patient presentation rate for these on average worked out to 16.5. So if we round that up, 17 people per 1,000 people at the festivals sought care, which is really helpful to know. So that if we scale this up, if we have 10,000 people estimated to show up, then we can just multiply that by 10. And again, these numbers aren't perfect, but it does give us a little bit of help to retrospectively look back and see kind of what worked and give us a bit more historical context for some of these events. The percentage of patients seen and transferred was 1.5%, which is really great. So of all the patients that we saw, only 1.5% of them were transferred out of our care and sent to the local hospital, which is again really nice. So we know that number is low, and we aren't really causing a big impact to the local communities. But that doesn't give us the full picture, because it doesn't really tell us on a 1,000th level how many folks are actually being sent to the hospital. So when we flip that, the transfer to hospital rate equals 0.25 per 1,000. So when we round that up to the nearest whole number, we know that kind of 1 in every 4,000 people at these festivals would likely be sent to the hospital by their own means, by ambulance, some way to seek additional care. But that doesn't tell us the ambulance rate. So we have the ATR, the ambulance transfer rate, to help with that. So we know that from these festivals, our ambulance transport rate was 0.12 per 1,000. So to get a whole number, that works out to be about 8,300. So for every 8,300 people that showed up, about 1 person would be transferred to the hospital by an ambulance. So this does help with some historical planning. It helps us to compare events, and it really gives us a bit more knowledge to work with. The caveat, though, with these metrics is that we're basing some of this off of the attendance rate, which is estimated and usually pulled from media sources, which isn't always the most accurate. And the other caveat is that there's a wide spectrum for these numbers. So just across these 4 festivals over these 2 years, our patient presentation rate, when we round to the nearest whole number, ranged from 3 to 97. So there isn't a straight line. They don't always cross events because of the number of variables that these events experience, which we'll talk about shortly. I'll pass it over to Kevin.
That's me. Thanks. So types of mass gathering, I think the two salient points here, as you can read the list, is that the planned and the unplanned, right? Or the spontaneous and the planned. And the planned are the ones that we focus on because we've been called to like most mass gathering organizations have been called to try and work through the planned events. Athletic, community-based, culture-based, political, religious, and then the unplanned. And the unplanned is going to be the ones that can happen spontaneously due to protests. They can happen for different reasons. If it's a ticketed event, chances are. The issue with the unplanned is the unplanned outside of the planned event. So it's the event that's happening outside of the event, the tailgating, if you will, the pre-preparation, the lineup, the staging, right? People waiting to get in where the jurisdiction is uncertain. Is it the responsibility of the organizer? Is it responsibility of the property, or is that in the public safety domain where somebody would have to enact a public safety order to contain and deal with these people and folks in spaces? So we're fortunate enough that we're involved mostly at this level in the planned events, but the unplanned stuff is also the element of uncertainty that we're interested in. So if we go through the next set of slides, we start to think about how our events classified, right? And size does matter, right? Because size is an influencer of some outcomes, although those outcomes are unpredictable. I was speaking at the Ontario Race Directors Seminar this past week, and of course the adage is, 5K, they're not dangerous, marathons are dangerous. And the answer is we can't quantify, we'd say that because we need more people like Haddon and the team doing research to actually say that, because a person preparing for a marathon has put effort into the planning, preparation, and training. Somebody doing a 5K may do it spontaneously, and it's hard to metrics that out to say, is it risky or unrisky based on the health of that individual and the variables that are present. At a similar level, small, medium, large, mega. We don't see many large and mega sized events in Canada, other than you could think about some of the more than the unticketed events like in Vancouver, the Celebration of Lights, where you could quantify that there's 300,000 people staring at this event, but some of them are sitting in their comfort of their own home. So it's hard to quantify. And then things like Olympics and FIFA that are coming to Canada, we can start to put some metrics to the overall impact that those events have on the community. But it's really hard to say on a specific date and time unless it's a bound or ticketed event. We believe, right, that scale's not necessarily risk. And that was my point about the 5K versus the marathon, is that there's just a magnitude of more people on the ground, and the longer they're there, the more that the longer they're there and the more that people that are there, the chances are statistically that something could happen. I think our approach it's been very much risk match care. Can we quantify the risk based on the data metrics that we have, the audience profile that we're able to create, which is, do we understand who these people are, who's attending, right? The attendees at the Rolling Stone at 60,000 is a different demographic that's going to be at Nickelback on Sunday night of Boots and Hearts. It's a different demographic, right? And it has to do with population and attraction. So I think as we look through those, if we look through those various scenarios, how do we assess the risks, right? And the biggest part of this is the meat and the potatoes of what we do in the back end. The risk side or the actuarial side is how do we quantify the risks associated with the space. And I think Haddon and I are going to ask a question here through a live poll tool. So Haddon, take it away.
Yeah, awesome. So we wanted your input, and we wanted to see what things you guys would consider when factoring in risk. So I just dropped a link in the chat. So you just want to spend 30 seconds and just fill out some of the things that you would consider for risk. Ideally, this will pop up in the slides. So we'll see how that pans out. If it doesn't, then we'll talk about it a little bit. You can just read off some of the things that folks are saying. So okay. Alcohol, age, demographic, weather, lots of demographic answers, which is great. Location, substance use, the terrain, access, egress. I love somebody said the feel of the crowd, the audience profile of the crowd. That's a really neat way of explaining it. Indoor versus outdoor, so just basic indoor versus outdoor geography, weather impacts, access and egress, genre of music. Again, Shania Twain's going to bring a different audience than U2. They're going to bring a different audience than Nickelback, right? So that's great. Historical numbers. Hey, Haddon, that's a great call out. I don't know who put that one in, but that's a good thing. Size of venue,
right? So what's the physical layout? How many square feet? How many square meters? How many acres are you dealing with? And then objective hazards, things like water features. We work at a couple music festival where there's water present, and what does that impact you on the response that we could be predictable to have, and or some of the injuries that may be present. So, cool. That's some great stuff. So yeah, over to you, Haddon, on the dream model.
Yeah, so we'll kind of just give a quick overview of this. So this was a model that was like kind of a conceptual model to assess risk and really kind of put some of these really variable conditions and factors into in a way that we as a group and as researchers and as readers and planners, we can take that and start to implement some of those factors. So this is from a paper that was published in 2021 by Dr. Turris, Dr. Lund, Dr. Munn, Liz Kasmer, Chris Callahan, and I. And so really in here, we just see that there's a few different stages of an event, right? So risk as a whole isn't just at the event. There's the pre-event, there's the post-event. So we break it into the pre-event, the during event, and the post-event sections. And then that kind of corresponds with our planning, our operations, and our analysis and learnings. So when we actually, this is the lean model. So when we break it out a bit more, this is what it looks like as a whole. But we'll start a little bit slower, a little bit smaller. So our pre-event, so these are the considerations that we have before the event starts. So a lot of things that have already been spoken about here, on-site healthcare, the environmental factors, the anticipated population, the descriptive factors of the event, lots of these things that can really influence the way that an event will turn out. And this model is just important to know. It's just the way that we can kind of visualize some of these factors and how they work together in the context of an event. How they're weighted is very different, and that's something we don't have an answer for right now. So how much of a factor does weather play compared to the demographics, compared to legislation and all that? But just factors to think of before the event starts. And then when we're on event, so some of the factors that we're going to consider here are capacity, those rare events. So what are those unforeseen or low risk, high impact events? New discovered risks, time factors, lots of different influences that can actually change how the event outcome can occur. And then we have the post event. So what are the actual outcomes of this event and what risks do those pose? So for instance, if an event is closing at 11 o'clock and we still have 15 patients, are those patients going to go to the hospital? Are they going to create a burden in the local healthcare system? What are the impacts of that event that span beyond the event after the gate has shut? And then how do we actually learn from that and process that in a way that we can help our understanding for the future event, or bring it back to the client, the event organizer, so that they have that working knowledge about some of those factors. But we found that this is a nice way to kind of introduce this topic and share kind of how the flow is and the considerations at each stage of the thought process. So ultimately, why is this all important? Why are we here talking about this? Why are we even a presentation on it? Because really, by understanding some of the operational pieces, some of the academic pieces, how it all flows together, we think that this is a way that we can help enhance our understanding of safety and events as a whole. And ideally, the outcome will be that we have safer events. Because there are lots of unfortunate things that can happen at events, as the news frequently shows. And as such, these are some of the things that we want to avoid when we're on festivals or events, and really be able to provide care and a really great medical response to if they were to happen. But the takeaway here with this slide is that these emergencies don't just happen at music festivals or art shows or sporting events. They really happen across the spectrum. They happen in religious contexts. They happen in unplanned capacities. They can happen kind of anywhere at any time, which is the kind of crazy part about mass gatherings. And so This is a paper by Sharma that came out December of this past year. And really, they kind of looked at the number of deaths at mass gatherings associated with stampedes and crowd surges and other contributors. So this is just the first half of a table. There's quite a bit more. But the one I wanted to highlight was the Hajj, when in 1990 they recorded 1,426 deaths as a result of the stampedes, right? So the Hajj is this really large pilgrimage in the Middle East that happens on an annual basis, and there are millions of folks who are involved in this. So it's a really, really big event, and luckily over the last decade, really, the science and the understanding of this event in particular has really taken a forefront and really started to be enhanced. So if you go to a mass gathering medicine conference or listen to some speakers, the Hajj is often referenced, and there's usually a couple of papers or abstracts about this one specific event because it is so large and held on an annual basis and has such a strong role in society. So this is just to highlight that back in 1990, there was a large tragedy. Many folks died as a result. But the science and the understanding of crowd safety in mass gathering medicine really wasn't quite the same as it was now. So over time, we would kind of expect these headlines to diminish over time. However, in 2015, there was another stampede that caused at least 2,400 folks to die. So we can see that even over time, there may not be that same level of change. And really what we're working towards in this field and everyone on this call is to help ensure that these sort of events don't reoccur and are mitigated as best possible. But to do that, when we look at in the Canadian and international context, we really need some more support with that in order to ensure that crowd safety and these events go off with the proper medical resources and the proper planning. So when we look in the Canadian context, provincially, there's very few municipalities in Canada that actually have guidelines or regulations or implement plans that associated with events that are planned. And so there's inconsistencies, there's kind of unknowns as to where certain figures come from because there isn't a standard, there isn't a set guideline out there. And so across Canada, a few municipalities have their own guidelines, but they don't really compare and they don't really cross-pollinate. Nationally, across Canada, there are no guidelines, there's no regulations, there's nothing from the federal government that says you can and can't do this at events or really giving any guidance around this topic in general. And when we zoom out even further into the international context, that lack of guidance and regulations is still very much there. So there aren't any international guidelines or regulations. There's no way for us to compare events outside of research and a couple of other news articles for these sort of things. And so it's kind of challenging to really look at strengthening this field and our basis of knowledge for this, because it's hard to understand what else is happening out there. So this leads us to our last kind of talking point here around the future goals of this area. So really what we're hoping in the next kind of decade is that there will be more guidelines on a municipal and a federal international level that can help support the provision of care and planning for these. It's already well on its way, which is terrific. There's been a lot more attention for special events and mass and major planned events over the years, and we're hoping that continues so that there is a bit more support for these events so that we can take all the proper steps to mitigate danger and risk. The second goal is, this is a project that lots of folks on the mass gathering medicine interest group has been working on, led by Dr. Brendan Munn, is the creation of a registry so that we can actually compare events across Canada or ideally even internationally so that we can see what's happening, and that when there is an event in Canada that matches the exact same profile as an event in Australia, we can compare the outcomes and see what worked and what didn't. The last sort of future goal for us is really standardizing the terminology. So there are still lots of variants in how we talk about this field. So even, is it mass gathering medicine? Is it event medicine? Is it major planned events? Is it major events? Is it there's a lot of misalignment in this area. And so while we're all trying to speak the same language, there's still some areas that we're not fully aligned on. So ideally within the next decade, these will be some things that we're able to start to check off that list and help strengthen this field. And lastly, if you're interested in some of this stuff, there's lots of great resources out there. The first is the World Association of Disaster and Emergency Medicine, WADM. They have a mass gathering medicine special interest group that has some resources, and WADM as a whole has a lot of great resources. The second is this Asper Tracy mass gathering or special event module. It has a lot of easy to find text and readings around what mass gathering medicine is and going in on some of these topics. The Torrens Resiliency Initiative, which is based out of Flinders in Australia, which is a WHO partner to support research out here. And the WHO, World Health Organization, does have their own mass gathering division now, which is great in their own education. And last but not least, on the Odyssey website, there's lots of great information as well. And there's a lot of cool resources that can be found. So thank you all so much for attending the lecture portion of this presentation. And we also just wanted to give a special shout out to members of the Odyssey team and the research group who are doing some great work, Dr. Lund, Dr. Turris, Dr. Munn, for advancing this field.
Awesome, Haddon. That was amazing, and that was a lot of information in a short period of time. But it galvanizes a couple of points. No, I loved it. It's the reason why I could listen to you talk all day is because it takes your brain up to a stratosphere, right? And you know that I always think a little bit more operationally and micro. So a couple of salient points is by virtue of the terminology used in this presentation, I want everyone to believe that they were designed to be in the most respectful way. We could use the word first aid, we could use the word EMR, EFR, the EMT, they're all colloquial names, but we're trying to under bands of certification that represent a certain level of care that is legislated more often than not, right? It is legislative care in the sense that there's a certification level. You may have lots of training in one area, but limited by certification. And certification is just a stamp in time, right? Everybody that I believe, if I can profess a personal philosophy, that most people that end up in medicine, mass gathering medicine, have come from the caring professions. So you started your career as a babysitter, a dog walker, a caregiver. You started your trajectory in this because you actually cared about people. If you were going to pursue money, you would have pursued other professions, maybe dentistry. So you would have pursued something different with a unlimited earning income. So we recognize the contribution of all people, and I think if you look back on your personal history, you probably realize what I'm talking about in starting in the caring professions. Second is that the newspaper, Jenna, the answer is death is irrevocable and final. So the point of what we're trying to do in the context of mass gathering medicine support, so protecting the community, and the communities for which we participate in the events need to be protected because their healthcare systems are fragile. For unexpected patients into a small community could have a large impact on the ability for us to service their daily needs, especially in the Squamishes and up in the corridor. I think of our friends that work up in the corridor, there's no spare ambulances sitting around, and it's not like a major metropolitan city where you have other resources, whereas, you might be the only resource in that corridor. So our job as MGM folks is to look at the local community and to ultimately try to reduce the impact that the event has on the community by providing on-site care. The level of care that is provided has to be risk matched, and it also has a budgetary component, right? So being able to look at a place like the Hodge that becomes the general medical call for people in the services that are provided at the Hodge from a medical perspective, have a lot to do with the attraction of the audience. It's a religious pilgrimage, and it attracts people of a certain age who come with a backpack full of medical conditions. So the last couple of minutes that we have together, I think we have 18 minutes at this point because we do want to be interested in time, is that there's 3 questions, and Haddon and I are going to prompt them. I'll just go through them, and it's just going to be him and I. And if you have comments, please use the chat. What interests you in MGM, and that'll be to Haddon. And then we're going to go to question 2, and then why I'm going through the questions. We're going to pull the questions down so we can put the big screen up. What do you see the future of MGM? What do you think the challenges are? So what's the future? What interests you? What do you think the challenges are, and what do you think the future holds? So we're going to go to the big screen, and if you're on video, you'll be able to see everybody. If you're not on video, no problem at all. So my first question back to my colleague is, what interests you about MGM? What draws you towards this or subset of medicine?
I think on the academic side, I think it's really fascinating to try to get that answer of, can we predict what's going to happen at these events? Is there a formula out there where we can plug in these different variables and see, okay, this is a multi-day festival, it's bound, it's going to be hot, add in all these factors, punch in how many people are going to show up, and then spits out a number of anticipated patients, hospital transfers, because that could really be the flipping point of this. And in terms of emergency action plans and sharing this with hospitals and communities, it's we have 10,000 people, here's what we think is going to happen. But right now, because of all the variables and because that this area is still very much in development, we don't really have that formula right now. We don't have those answers. So I think on the academic side, it's really fascinating to try to solve some of those really interesting questions. But in the totality of it, mass gathering medicine is a really unique and cool area because of the domains that it pulls from. So many really fascinating harm reduction areas that we're amping up and integrating at a really great level and seeing those positive outcomes. Really cool to have the ability to provide excellent pre-hospital care and work with so many great colleagues on that front. Amazing that we can basically create a field hospital and support these attendees and participants in a way that is quite unique and really takes that burden off the local healthcare system. So really lots of cool ways that the care is provided at these events, which is fascinating to actually watch unfold and be a part of.
I think what interests me is you're absolutely right. The 70% of the work that we do is in the planning process, right? And then how do we bring the planning processes, and does it prove that we actually know what we're doing? What I love about MGM is it's pre-planned mass casualties, right? And I think about the systems that people put in place and say, we've got all these triage systems, and they never get practiced and they never get stress tested. So what we're doing is we're stress testing. That's one. Two, the public-private partnership. The pandemic opened the door for public agencies to realize that they can work with private agencies to deploy on a national scale and an international scale the process of vaccination and supporting healthcare systems. I won't get into the context of the Canadian politics of privatized healthcare, but we're providing a service that a bureaucracy such as a government would struggle to provide at the level that would meet the client's expectations. So the care and the extension of the services that we provide, and the team that's been working with us, and not to make it about us, but 90% of what we do is customer service on event, right? 5% of the time we're changing an outcome. And had our services or similar services not been available, I believe that the patient would have suffered a life-altering outcome. And 5% of the time, we have no clue what we're doing. But that's okay, because I think the uncertainty of mass gathering medicine is the unpredictably of going into the battlefield. It's the unpredictably of going into the outdoors. It's the opportunity to go into an austere environment and know that there's an element of uncertainty, and there's a little bit of discomfort and excitement that comes with that, right? There's why do people go camping? Why do you put all your shit in a bag and go walking across the barren earth and put yourself in a situation where it's uncertain? It's because the actual act of that is what's gratifying, right? So, and I think that final point, Haddon, is also reframing out of hospital care, right? Pre-hospital care, by definition, by the way you use the words, is pre-hospital, meaning I am going to take you to a hospital. And the answer is we can treat you out of a hospital. And Haddon asked me a really good point yesterday. We had we get into these really nerdy conversations. He's kind of like my mass gathering soulmate when we start getting into these conversations about, it's could we ever quantify the dollars? Could we ever say that the savings by having a mass gathering medicine team on site providing the care, can it actually save the system money? And we came down to a very simple, the simple way that we could do it is we have to charge by the stitch. So we figured that the only way to measure this is if somebody were to divert from the hospital into one of our care facilities on site, and we were able to provide them with suturing, that is actually a save to the system, because that burden doesn't burden, but length and distance and the equipment, there's a lot of, it's multifactorial to figure out what the actual savings is. And that's just more of the operational business aspects. So Haddon, I think it's a wonderful question in its own right, is what interests you. So back to you for our next prompt.
Yeah. Yeah, and actually just in here, and credit to our student Daniel for prompting that conversation about finances and mass gatherings, but lots of great comments in here as well. So Bobby mentioned this is similar to what you did in the military, and you're working in these sort of self-sustaining environments, which I totally agree with. Meredith mentioning that you're practicing an unpredictable and sometimes austere environment, which is terrific, and how that translates over to enhancing your clinical skills and your knowledge in your day job as a clinician. And Lori as well mentioning the unpredictableness and the challenges that come with it, which is, I think, fun for all of us.
And Lori, I have to say this on Lori's behalf. It's also the fun, right? The fact is it's coming home, it's being with a group of people and seeing people outside of uniform. And that's a belief that I have. When you see people contextually outside of their day-to-day working environment, it's kind of like when you saw your high school teacher after you graduated at the bar. There's kind of this funness that comes with the fact that you're now sharing that space with them and they view you differently. So particularly in the clinical setting, when you work inside the rigidities of a four-walled institution, is you have protocols, expectations, steel toe boots, hard hats, all the things that you have to wear, whereas you can come on the MGM scene and it's a little bit different in the sense that we can behave and represent the environment for which we're working in. We're not working in a heavy industrial environment. So Haddon, you did a wonderful job of bringing in the comments from the audience. So thanks for that.
And a couple of, so Aaron mentioning crowd psychology, again, super cool. Kim mentioning collaboration between different levels. Lots of really, really great areas that we're able to focus in on here. The second prompt we have is just around what makes MGM challenging. Kev, do you want to kick it off?
Yeah, I think it segues from the last, right? The uncertainty, right? The uncertainty of what we're going into, the unpredictability of the environments and the outcomes. Having been on events where we've had to do multiple mass evacuations, we've had to be prepared for multi-casualty incidents that have never transpired. So the preparation and the lead up and the anticipation, and then getting to the event and not doing any of what you thought you were going to do, right? So you build up to this peak or this summit, and that summit never happens, which is a good thing. So there's a contradiction in event medicine, which is we're prepared for all this stuff. We actually want to do this. And then at the end of the day, you're like, oh, I have a 0 patient count, right? So you anticipated and built up to that. So how do you deal with that? That's one. The second one is there's obviously challenges in the workforce coming out of a pandemic, and there were through a pandemic. And I had lots of services that we worked with that said, oh, we can't let our staff go to mass gathering medicines because our hospital system is crushed. And I'm thinking to myself, be it that today is Bell Let's Talk Day. So for our Canadian friends, this is a day to talk about mental health. And I can think of many practitioners who have said to me, man, I was really lucky to go to that event. It just allowed me to be at work in a contextually different environment. And it was refreshing because I got to practice medicine in a different space and I didn't have all the regular pressures. So how do we integrate that in the world that still has these higher expectations and pressures, and the healthcare isn't normal? And I could say that it's not going to be normal for a number of years. So the challenge is, how do we entice this? How do we open up the opportunity to wider groups and showcase the opportunity to come and actually practice medicine in a very different way? So we've been fortunate enough to forge partnerships with people who get that. They understand it. So what about you? What do you think the challenges are? And I'm going to call our time. We're going to call our time at 3:52. So we got 8 minutes to do the last 1.5.
Yeah, absolutely. I think you covered a lot of the similar operational challenges that I was thinking of. I think maybe on the academic side, one of the challenges that which we spoke about before is just the lack of standardization and how everyone is sort of doing their own thing to a degree. Like, even when you look at metrics from across different papers and different authors and research groups, it's like some people use per 1,000, some people use per 10,000. There's different acronyms for the same metric. So like when you're looking at like patient presentations, there's like 3 different ones that you can use for it, which is kind of challenging because it makes that comparability really hard. And when you can't compare, you can't really get a glimpse as to what's happening in other areas and use that information for your benefit. But in the same sense that it's a challenge, but it's also a really cool way that we're looking to help support that and solve those sort of problems. So I think that's kind of the primary one. I think the other thing too is that in terms of challenges, I think local organizations and governments are starting to realize it now, but for such a long time, this stuff was kind of put on the back burner, and that leads to these events that aren't properly supported. And I think getting more international organizations on board to support the development of policies and guidelines and resources has been a challenge historically. And I think now it's becoming a little bit less of an issue as we're recognizing that crowd safety is a really, really big, important factor in public events. And that also translates into security and averting these unnecessary constraints and unnecessary pressure on our healthcare system. And in the chat, we're having some comments saying communications can be a challenging aspect. Totally agree. When we have all these clinicians coming from different areas, different services, different hospitals, sort of kind of the same thing about standardization, kind of talking their own language in some aspects. I think everyone's saying the same thing when it matters, but some of the little nuances are different. Tracy made a good point in the chat as well. Good planning can make nothing happen. I think we see that a lot in public health as well, where there's all this planning and this great rollout, and then because of that, they don't see the anticipated numbers that they were hoping to avoid, and then the implication and the assumption from those who aren't aware is that, oh, we didn't need to do all that work because nothing happened, right? And Lori, totally agree about standardization from teams and helping to share knowledge. Yeah, I think that's great. So I think maybe our last question, which we have a couple minutes for, is what's the future of MGM hold? If you want to kick us off, Kev.
I think the future starts tomorrow. I think you and I have an interesting conversation that's never been had in Canada before, which is bringing together municipal paramedic services to have a conversation about what's the number, right? What's the number of ambulances you need to have at a marathon? What's the number of ambulances you need to have for a rock concert? So I think is insulated and local as that feels, the conversation starts tomorrow, figuratively and literally, because the call is tomorrow. But we're starting to have some conversations, trying to pull together under different organizations that have some attraction and appeal other than Odyssey, to say, can we under these different banners pull people together to start having world athletics and the live music industry, right? This is such an important opportunity coming out of the global pandemic, because it is a little bit of a rebirth, right? So we've had our reset in 22. Now we're having the rebirth, and now we're being able to have a conversation with people, because now safety is just a little bit higher on people's priority list. Because pre-pandemic, people couldn't spell PPE. No idea. We laughed at people who traveled with masks on, and now we're thinking, oh, that's just normal, right? So I think for us that the time is now, and the rebirth coming out of a pandemic is to have the conversation. We're having a more true and honest conversation with our strategic delivery partners about what this actually looks like. And I think the opportunity for public-private relationships to be built to strengthen both the inevitable need, which is coming, right? And I'm a big fan, and I love citizens' response. I love when the community responds to crises, but I love to see it done in an organized fashion, right? So spontaneous response to a natural disaster can be organized through citizens groups if they are loosely organized. And I believe that a foundation and an opportunity for training people on how to do that is the environment that we create. Come, learn, practice, perfect. Over to you, my friend, and final words, and we've got 3 on the clock.
Perfect. Always great when we keep it within the time frame. So I'll keep mine nice and short. I think the future is really, again, just rooted in collaboration. Like Kevin mentioned, working towards this really collaborative plan with local paramedic services across Canada to try to really I think, expand on what we're working with already around these action plans, these emergency action plans. So it's these our local healthcare systems aren't learning about events the day of, and it's not someone who's already working in the ED and someone else saying, "Oh, I heard there's a big 20,000 person festival happening next door," that the hospital wasn't aware of, the staff weren't aware of, so they can kind of predict and upstaff and just be mentally prepared for as well as physically. And so I think that's what I'm really looking forward to is that next progression, which I'm sure will be within the next few years. We will wrap it up just with 2 minutes left on the clock. So we just want to say thank you so much for everyone for taking time out of your day to tune in and join us for the first webinar. This will be a monthly segment that we have now. We have members from Odyssey and outside coming in to give these talks once a month now, around the same time near the end of the month. So there'll be a monthly email sent out with the RSVP and some Zoom information on that. And then the topics are going to be they're going to vary across mass cellular medicine. So we're going to talk about some telecommunication stuff, MCIs, harm reduction, some more presentation on a macro level, some really cool topics that we think that everyone is obviously familiar with, but pulling in those subject matter experts to talk about them a bit more in depth and to share some more granular details, which we're really looking forward to. Like I mentioned, this is recorded and we'll be sharing this via email, and we'll also put them on the Odyssey intranet site as well, so that you can receive them and review them as you wish.
Awesome. As always, so eloquently put. Guys, you are also the experts. So as we progress these conversations, we're going to obviously want to encourage you guys to put forward topics. If there's appetite, they can happen more frequently as we feel that there's appetite. I also think that there's an offshoot of this, which may become a bit more of an organic conversation instead of a presentation, where they can just be, I do a couple of these, they actually happen once a week. And it's not usually a large group, but it's 12 to 15 people. And we're talking particularly on the crowd science and safety side of things. So to my partner in crime, Haddon Rabb, amazing. To all of you for attending. Some I haven't seen in a bit, which I'd love to see. Haven't seen ever on video, which is amazing. Some of you we see too often on video. We'd like to see you more often in person. If you're in Ontario, travel safely today, please. If you're out in the West Coast, just hope it doesn't snow, because it just turns into a gong show out there. We'll make these available. The second thing and follow up is we are going to send out a feedback form. We really want you to fill it out. Be honest. Okay, radical candor is a thing. Just be honest. Tell us how we can improve it. We will take the feedback from people that we respect, of course, to say, hey, this is where you could have done something different, and we accept that. So in the spirit of time, have a great day, folks.
Awesome. Thanks so much, guys. Have a great day.